Hello and thank you for watching. In this video I'm going to be going over the different feet that come as standard with the PFAFF models. Now depending on the model will depend on what feet come with that, but generally there are sort of 4 or 5 that come with every model of PFAFF machine. As you then come up in the range you then get a few extras. So you will always have the 0A foot, the 1A foot and the 2A foot as standard with every single model of PFAFF. You will also have the zipper foot, the blind hem foot and a buttonhole foot, and there are 2 different types of buttonhole feet depending on which model you've got. So to start with I'm going to have a look at these 2. Now at quick glance these 2 look pretty identical. The 0A or the 0A is the one that is on the machine when you get it out of the box, and that is great for straight stitch and sort of general zigzag, nothing that's got too small a stitch length. You then got the 1A foot. Again, both of them can use the IDT, but if we flip them over you will see that the 0A is completely flat. The 1A has a recess underneath to help it glide over dense stitching. So if you are doing a satin stitch, for example, this will help glide over that stitching better than what the 0A foot will. You've then got the difference between the 1A and the 2A. The main difference is you can see there is no cut out the back for the IDT. Underneath they both have the recess to help glide over the decorative stitching. However, a lot of the decorative stitching doesn't allow you to use the IDT because of the movements and sort of the type of stitch. So you then use your 2A foot. I'm going to give you an example of using the incorrect foot for the decorative stitching and how much of a difference it can actually make. Okay, so let's talk about this stitch sample I've got here. So this particular star stitch recommends to use the 2A foot. So no IDT and definitely needs the recess underneath to get over this dense satin stitch. This first star here, I used the 0A foot with IDT engaged, and as you can see it didn't get very far before it started to just sew itself on the spot and make a mess. So I kept the 0A foot on, but I disengaged the IDT and it stitched out okay. You might not see it on the camera, but actually it's quite bumpy. It's not a very smooth satin stitch. So I then pop the correct foot on. It's much flatter and a much neater satin stitch that is created by using the correct foot. So that's why it's really important to always use the correct stitch and look for the information as to whether you can use the IDT or not with that stitch. As you can see, for some stitches it just does not work. So if we just have a look at the screen, so I'm using the Quilt Expression 720, but if you've got an Ambition machine that will also have a digital display, don't forget it tells you all the information on the screen. So it'll always tell you what foot to use, whether the IDT should be engaged, and also this symbol here means stabilizer. So if you are doing decorative stitching, then using a stabilizer such as a stitch and tear behind the fabric really helps give you a better result as well. So the next foot I'm moving on to is the blind hem foot, which has got the number 3 on. So this can also be used for some of the overedge or overcast stitching as well. First of all I'm going to talk about how to use it as a blind hem foot. Now the blind hem is all about how you fold the fabric to start with, and This is the way that I've found works really well. So you have your, say you want to take up a trouser hem or a skirt and you don't want to see the hem. A blind hem is brilliant for this. So I have to excuse my wonky cutting on the fabric. Say this is the bottom of my item, whether it's a trouser leg. I'm going to first of all mark where I want the finished length to be. So for the purpose of this, I'm just going to use a fabric marker and draw a straight line along. So that mark is where I want the trouser leg to finish. I then work out how sort of deep I want the hem to be. I suppose the majority of the time you'd be looking at a sort of a 1.5 hem. So I'm then going to mark a line above that 1.5 centimetres away. Okay, so I'm going to start by using this top line, and I'm going to use that as my fold mark to fold the fabric right sides together. And normally, obviously, give that a good press with the iron. I'm just going to finger press it. I'm then going to fold the fabric back on itself to that line that I've marked where I want my trouser hem to finish. So I don't know if you can see that purple line there is where I'm folding the fabric back on itself. So the folding of the fabric is a little bit like origami to start with. It's definitely one of those techniques, the more you do it, the more you get used to. You're then going to work on the wrong side of the fabric. So you've got a nice fold going down here. This is all excess fabric. Once you've done your hem and you're happy with it, you can trim this away, overlock it, use the Overcast Stitch on the sewing machine, whatever you need to do to neaten up that. Personally, I wouldn't do it until I am happy with the length, just in case I need to budge it down a little bit and I've suddenly run out of fabric. That's not going to be any good. So on the blind hem foot, we have got this red guide here. And as you're sewing, that is going to be butting up against that fold that we have created. Now the blind hem stitch does 3 or 4 straight stitches and then switches over to a zigzag, goes back down straight stitch and over to a zigzag. What you want is when it swings over to a zigzag, you want the needle just to catch a very, very small amount on this fold here. So I'm going to set it up on my machine, show you how you can adjust it and show you exactly how it works when you are sewing. So I'm going to go into my essential stitches and choose the blind hem. Now, if you're unsure of which one to use, you can either look in your manual, which will give you the list, or if you've got the question mark on your machine, you can hit the question mark, tap on the stitch, and it will tell you whether that is the blind hem stitch or not. So I'm going to select that. I can use the ID2 with the blind hem, which is great if you're doing it on a tricky fabric that you want that sort of extra feed with. And you can adjust the width, so you can make it narrower if you need to, or slightly wider. So I'm then going to pop my fabric underneath the foot. So I've given that a good press so that fold is nice and crisp. And I'm just going to start by lowering my foot down. So you can see here that that red wheel is lining up with that fold of that fabric here. You can adjust that accordingly depending on how the stitch is running. So you will need to do a few test pieces to get it set up correctly. So I'm going to slow the machine right down and just start off by doing a couple of stitches. So you can see it's coming down, swinging across to the left, swinging across, swinging across. Now that is probably catching too much fabric. because you don't want that stitch to show on the right side of your fabric. So you can adjust this wheel to push it further away. Okay, so I've moved that wheel further away from the edge of the foot, and immediately that is looking much better. And you would normally use the same colour thread, you'd get a colour match. For this I'm going to use purple contrasting thread just so I can show you how it looks on the other side. Okay, so you can see where I started that is covering too much of that fabric, because you're then going to pull that to the right sides. So that would then be my hem, and you can see at the top far too much of that thread is showing, but after the adjustment you have got just a very small speck of thread showing through, and obviously if that was the same colour as your fabric you would not see that, that would completely disappear. You might be able to fine tune it even more to catch even less fabric, but that's a pretty good blind hem. And then, as I said, if you want to, you can tidy up the back, you can trim off this excess fabric or overlock it if it's a fabric that might fray. So that leads nicely on to what else you can use this particular foot for. So it's the blind hem foot predominantly, but every machine will have a selection of overcast stitches, which are the next best thing to an overlock stitch created on an overlocker. So it obviously is not exactly the same because it's only using a top thread and a bobbin thread, whereas an overlocker uses 3 or 4 threads at a time. But it is a good alternative if you haven't got an overlocker. So they're called overcast stitches or over edge stitching, and there'll be lots of different types. There'll be some suitable for stretch, some for sort of woven medium, and some of the stitches will be used with the blind hem foot, which is the number 3 foot. So I've selected a stitch and you can see it's come up with number 3. So I'm going to leave the blind hem foot on and use it for the edge of my fabric. So on the back of the foot there is a small sort of metal wire. If you line the red section up with that, because you want your edge of your fabric to be running against the edge, you can use it as a guide to help keep you straight, so that that metal section falls against the edge of the fabric. Okay, so you can see that that red is butting up against the edge of my fabric, and that the metal sort of bar underneath is also lining up against it. So that when the needle swings over to the right, it's just catching the very edge of the fabric. Okay, and then that gives you a nice overcast seam. Some of the over edge or overcast stitches will just use the 1A foot. So again, depending on which stitch you're using, if I select that one for example, it's telling me just to use the 1A foot. So always double check which one you're using for that particular stitch. So I'm going to quickly cover the zipper foot, but it is quite sort of self-explanatory when you realise how it goes on. I know some people sort of get a bit confused because it's so small and there's lots of different sort of cutouts as to which way it goes on. So where the 4 is, that is the front of your zipper foot. And then it's got 2 cutouts for the IDT, and it's got 2 places where you can clip it on. Now that depends on whether you want your needle on the left hand side or the right hand side, depending on which half of the zip you are sewing. So there's great versatility there. So I'm going to pop it on the left hand side. Okay, so you can see I can still put that IDT in. Okay, and I've got that. Okay, so I've got it on the left hand side, as you can see, and then what you can do is by selecting a straight stitch. I have to excuse my wobbly camera skills for this, trying to do 2 things. So that is on the straight stitch in the centre needle position, and you can see just how nice and close that is getting in to the foot. So if you're putting a zipper in, you can get really, really close to make it as neat as possible. And then of course, if you need to take the needle position away, if it is too close for what you're sewing, you just move your stitch width, take it down, and that moves the needle over to the left. To bring it back, take the stitch width up and it takes it back in. So there is a little bit of play. You can take it in slightly closer, but obviously you just want to make sure that you're not hitting the needle against the foot. And then you can do exactly the same on the other side. So you just clip that off, and attach it on the other side. And again, by having it on a straight stitch in the centre needle position, it gets in really close to that side. So that's a really great little foot. You could also potentially use it for piping as well, because of how close you can get up the needle to the edge. So let's then move on to buttonhole feet. Now, again, depending on the model, you will depend on which buttonhole foot comes with your machine. Both one-step buttonholes. However, this one you push open the back and you place your button in there to determine the size. There is a sensor usually just behind sort of the needle on the machine that you need to pull down into position. The expression range upwards will have a Sensormatic buttonhole foot. So this actually plugs into the machine and you set the size on the screen. Okay. When you start, you need to make sure that that little red line is in line with the sort of the cutout on the metal side there. Okay, that's really important to make sure that that starts there. But adjust that once it's on the machine and you've got your fabric underneath. In both of these, there is a little prong at the back, and that is to help you create corded buttonholes. So a nice fine sort of gimping cord works really well, and it helps give a nice sort of professional finish to it, just give something extra to the buttonhole. That loops onto the back of that prong, and then the cord will then come underneath the foot as you sew. So I'm going to do one normal buttonhole foot and then I'm going to do one with the cord as well, just so you can see exactly how that works. So on the screen I'm going to select my buttonhole stitch, sorry. Okay. No IDT. That clips onto the machine, and then this plugs in to a port. I just plugs in up into the port in there. Got to make sure that's really pushed in that port properly in order for it to work. Okay, so then I can adjust the foot to make sure that it is in the right place, so that red arrow is in that red cutout. And then I'm going to select the size of buttonhole I want to do by using the plus arrows on the screen here. If I unplug that foot, that'll disappear and go back to stitch length. So the machine registers that you have put the foot in by changing that to the size of the buttonhole that you need to stitch out. Now again, buttonholes always use a stabilizer behind. It really helps give you a good finished result. Okay, so double checking that that red arrow is where it needs to be at the front of the buttonhole foot, and press go. Now I hold, oh, it's telling me my bobbin thread running low. I'm going to play bobbin chicken and hopefully finish this buttonhole without changing my bobbin. So just snip away that front thread so it doesn't start getting caught up. I'm just going to override that by pressing play. I'm going to put the speed up as well. So it's going to do a sort of a tapping stitch backwards, come forwards to sew the satin stitch, go back up the other side and then back down. And what's great about this is you don't have to reset. Once it's finished, you can press the scissors if you've got that function, and then just do your another one straight off, exactly the same size. Okay, so that's one perfect buttonhole. If I wanted to do a corded buttonhole, okay, so I've just took the foot off, just so it's a little bit easier to get access to. So I've made a loop in the middle of my cord. That's going to hook on to the back of that foot. I'm going to pull those two pieces of cord forward so I can then attach my foot back on. Okay, and then we've got two pieces of cord. Okay, like this. Again, make sure you reset the buttonhole so it's at the start. Make sure they're not twisted around. Okay. And you've got that guide at the front as well, just to make sure. So you've got a little prong at the front, so you can just hook the two pieces of cord through that, just to make sure that they're not twisting round. Okay, there we are then. Just get rid of that little bit of thread. Unhook the cord. Okay, and then all you need to do is just pull those through to hide the loop at the top, and then thread those on a sort of a wide-eyed needle, push through to the other side of the fabric and tie them off in the back. So that's one way of using the buttonhole foot. Some machines will come with what we call a manual buttonhole foot. If they don't come with it, they are available to purchase. So this, if you are wanting to do a bigger buttonhole than what is capable of your machine, you can use the manual buttonhole foot for, or sometimes the various, the sort of the buttonhole feet, whether it's the white plastic one or the plug-in Sensormatic one, don't always work with certain fabrics. So you might find that they're struggling on certain fabrics. Try using the manual buttonhole foot. So if you are using it on a machine that has got the buttonhole foot where you bring a sensor down, what you need to do is do one using this foot slowly and watch where the sensor is hitting. So generally it'll go back, the sensor will hit one of these pegs on the foot to tell the machine to start stitching back down the other way. So you then need to recreate that when you've got the manual buttonhole foot on. So you would mark out how big you want your buttonhole to be. You would start it off, and when it gets to the end where you want it to come back on itself, you manually push that sensor to tell the machine to come back the other way. So it will take a little bit of practice and a little bit of concentration, but it is possible. On the expression, it is much easier because all you need to do is hit the reverse button. And again, it's got this little lip on the back, so you can do corded buttonholes if you want to, using the manual buttonhole foot. So all you need to do is start the buttonhole, hit the reverse button when you get to the length you want it. Hit it again when you get to the start. I actually hit it a little bit prematurely there. As you can see, I didn't quite get to the start. So you just need to keep an eye on when it gets back to the start. Perhaps not stitch it quite so fast as what I was doing. Let me slow it down and try again. So I mean, my bobbin's low still. I'm getting quite a lot of buttonholes out of this bobbin that's low. So I'm just going to do a little one. Hit the reverse button and then just keep an eye on it when it's coming back down. And when it gets to the start, hit the reverse button again and it finishes it off. Okay. So as I said, some models come with the manual buttonhole foot in. If it doesn't, then they are available to purchase. And if we look underneath, this is why you can't always get away with using just a standard foot for a manual buttonhole, because it's got these two channels underneath to help glide over each row of the satin stitch that the buttonhole does. And the last foot that comes with the Quilt Expression 720, Performance Creative Icon, and some of the other embroidery machines, possibly the Creative 4.5, is the number 8 foot. And as you can see, this is a wider foot than, let me find the 2A foot. So this is designed for the maxi stitches, so the really wide decorative stitching, okay? It's got a wider recess, it's a wider foot to help allow for those bigger stitches. But again, the machine will tell you when you need to use that foot on. Because again, quick glance, they do look obviously very similar. You can't use the IDT, but the 8 is just a slightly wider and bigger foot to accommodate for those Omnimotion maxi stitches.